whilst Osborne used to say we're going to fix the roof while the sun shines, which I think is a phrase that goes back to John F. Kennedy, you had him today saying we're repairing the foundations of the house. It's not just the roof that's a bit leaky. The whole bloody thing is crumbling, and therefore we've got to do the foundations.
Having won an enormous majority just before the summer recess and having dealt with the recent rioting very competently, I would have thought that Keir Starmer should have come out and addressed the country with a more optimistic message. His press conference today in the Rose Garden really just delivered more doom and gloom, that we have to face more austerity and tax rises, but also frustration that he hasn't addressed the elephant in the room, which is Brexit, which we all know is the main reason why there is a black hole in the public finances.
Now, while Britain is heading towards recession and taxes are rising, it's tempting to wonder whether the economy would be any different if Brexit had never happened. The answer, according to research shared with ITV News, is yes, it would. The Centre for Economic Reform claims the government has lost out on £40 billion in taxes because of the damage done to the country's output by leaving the European Union.
Paul Johnson, director of the IFS, also points out that the commitments made by the Labour Party in their manifesto tied their hands on where they could raise revenue from, having decided to continue with Brexit. And so because of their manifesto, they're now having to be creative about refilling the black hole. Former advisor to David Cameron also pointed out how there is no vision, no plan for growth.
In terms of wages and remuneration for ordinary people, behind all of our peers, we're becoming the poor man of Europe again. And that's largely because we financialised the economy and our productivity started to drop before the financial crisis. And after the financial crisis, it hasn't recovered. We've flatlined. And there's nothing, what I worry about for Labour, I think their analysis that it's bleak is right. I think the Conservative Party didn't so much leave a black hole as make assumptions that departments would be able to cut, which everybody talked about at the time, which they can't. But what I think is most kind of stark is it doesn't look as if any of the plans that Labour has in place are sufficient to meet the task that Labour itself has acknowledged. It doesn't look to me like there's a really competent growth plan waiting in the wings that we probably are happy to pay a price for. So my sense is things will only get worse.
Philip, you've been a former advisor to a Prime Minister. When you hear things in that Rose Garden, that historic scene, like things are going to be painful, we've got no other choice, there are big asks, short-term pain for long-term gain, big asks, those with the broadest shoulders will have to carry the weight. What does that mean? We're being feathered up here for brutal tax rises. What do you think that will entail?
I think it will entail a whole range of tax rises outside of the commitment not to raise tax on ordinary people. So it won't raise tax on income tax, VAT, and all the standard national insurance. So it means all the additionals like inheritance tax, wealth tax, capital gains tax will be taxed. They may well bring in pensions within the inheritance tax regime or indeed the capital tax regime. So I think you're going to have all sorts of increases in untaxed activity or asset holding to make it all stitched together. But the problem is, and I repeat it again, is the Conservatives didn't have a solution to our productivity crisis on our economic flatlining. And Labour don't appear to have a solution either. That's why I think it's genuinely bleak. We are all human beings are prepared to pay a short-term price if there's a long-term gain. But what worries me is there a long-term gain? I don't see it. And as a result, I think that we could continue to flatline or worse.
Philip.
If Labour were to commit to getting rid of much of the Brexit trade barriers and dealing with Brexit, that would ensure growth. However, this government has decided to splash more cash on Brexit barriers and throw 10.5 million to try and ease the burden of the new checks which are going to be coming over the next few months.
And you just think that there must be a time where you say, OK, we've been the government now for X number of months, years, we take responsibility for it. It felt like this was a speech that was still in campaigning mode.
Yes, I think
rather
right.
than we are now the government.
I think they think, and maybe as I say, this is true, that, you know, the blame the Tory element, I mean, it could last years. I mean, it did for Osborne. Although, of course, there is a difference with the Labour government, which is that the Conservatives have much of the press on their side. That is a line that the Daily Mail, the Sun and others will happily kind of regurgitate sort of day after day, which influences the way the whole media thinks about it. Labour will have far less of that with the Conservative supporting press. I think there's another thing which I thought about it, though, which is I think if you're a voter and you're listening to Starmer today and you're hearing that things are going to get worse before they get better, you would be forgiven for thinking, bloody hell, I can't remember a time when a politician said things were going to get better, virtually. Perhaps with the exception of the boosterism of Boris Johnson, although maybe that's part of the reason it was successful, albeit for a short time. You know, on and off, more or less, you can argue we have had, again, 14 years of Osborneite kind of political strategy, that constant talk of pessimism before at some point things will get better in the longer term. And I just don't know how much bandwidth the country still has for that, for constantly hearing that kind of doom. I mean, Ernie Bevin, obviously one of the great figures of Labour history, who was Foreign Secretary and Minister of Labour during the war, he once said that he hoped to be the Minister of Labour until 1990. And obviously he didn't mean that literally. He meant that he would have a political strategy and transform industrial relations in the country during the Second World War, which would last for half a century. Sometimes it feels like George Osborne is going to be Chancellor until 2050. That there has not been a Chancellor or Prime Minister who have had the sort of political nous or strategy to move away from the way he thought about politics and the economy. And yet it is clear that in so many ways Osborneism, austerity, kind of that kind of political strategy, in so many ways has failed. And yet for lots of reasons, some structural, some political, some I think through sheer lack of imagination, Prime Minister and Chancellor, including even this Labour one or this Labour pair, keep finding themselves pulled back into the orbit of it. And I just think that for a Labour government and, you know, that strategy, for a Labour government, this is predicated on the idea that we will get re-elected and see off the forces of populism through improvements to the public services. I think Osborneism as a strategy will only take you so far, and it will need far greater imagination from the heart of the Labour government to think, how are we actually going to improve the public realm and think big and translate that into a politics which resonates? Because, as I say, this will get them so far. I don't think it will get them that far.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.
This factory in Cheshire makes cheese that was sold all over Europe. The owner says Brexit almost brought his business down. The paperwork was the killer. Shipments to customers in Italy, France and Germany now require export health certificates. £300,000 a year in sales has disappeared.
We're going to actually expand into Europe, but of course the transition period hit straight away. We lost the consumer market overnight, which meant that our plans, our new warehouse, our multilingual version of our website were all for nothing.
The government's own forecaster considers Brexit to have been an economic shock, but separating Brexit's impact from that of COVID and the war in Ukraine is tricky. The Centre for European Reform has modelled the economic performance of a UK that remained in the EU, using data from countries whose performance was similar to ours before Brexit. It then compared this with the real performance of the UK economy since the referendum 6 years ago. The analysis concludes that between April and June this year, our economy was 5.5% smaller than it would have been had we stayed in the EU. And in the year to June, lower growth cost the government around £40 billion in lost tax revenue. In a statement, a Treasury spokesman said, "We do not recognise this analysis. We are taking full advantage of the opportunities of Brexit, for example, through reforming EU rules for insurers to unlock £100 billion of infrastructure spending in the next decade, and by setting a skills-based migration policy which suits the UK's needs." At Little Star Jewellery in Derby, everything is designed in Britain but made in China. As a result, every shipment into the EU is now taxed and orders have slumped. We asked them if they believed the government when it said Brexit would prove a tremendous success.
I haven't heard a single positive Brexit story at all.
It's delusional, and it's just their rhetoric, because if they had to turn around and tell the truth about what is actually happening, it would be admitting that they're wrong.
2022 was supposed to be a year of recovery. Instead, we find ourselves in December staring into another recession. The war in Ukraine has brought us here, not Brexit, but in the background, the evidence shows Brexit has caused persistent economic damage.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment below, let me know what you think. And if you haven't subscribed, subscribe. And you can also hit the notification button, which will let you know every time I post a video.